Welcome back to Paranormal Inc. Ohio, the podcast where we tell the truth about the world's darkest mysteries into history. I'm your host, Ed. When we think of terrifying hauntings, our minds usually drift to sprawling, decaying Victorian mansions, ancient castles, or abandoned asylums. We think of places that look they should be haunted. But tonight we are crossing the Atlantic to a quiet post-war council estate in West Yorkshire, England. The year is 1966. The address is 30 East Drive, in a town called Pontefract. It was a perfectly ordinary 3-bedroom, semi-detached house. It had a neat little kitchen, a small garden, and white plastered walls. It was built in the 1950s to give working-class families a comfortable, predictable life. There were no gargoyles, no secret passages, no bloody history baked into the floorboards. Yet what happened inside those ordinary walls over a 4-year period remains the most violent, heavily witnessed, and downright bizarre poltergeist case in European history. A haunting so aggressive it defied the laws of physics, baffled the local police, and targeted a teenage girl with terrifying precision. They called him Fred. History calls him the Black Monk of Pontefract. And every single detail we are about to tell you tonight is an actual documented event. So let's head to 1966. It all began on a scorching hot summer bank holiday weekend, August 1966. Joe and Jean Pritchard, a hard-working local couple, had gone away for a short holiday, leaving their 15-year-old son Philip and his grandmother at home. It was a lazy, quiet afternoon. Philip and his grandmother were sitting in the living room when they noticed something strange. A fine, white, chalky powder began falling through the air. Now, you might think it was a ceiling crack, but it wasn't falling from the ceiling. Multiple witnesses later testified that the dust was materializing out of thin air just below head height, drifting lazily to the floor like phantom snow. Confused and a bit annoyed by the mess, Philip's grandmother called her daughter, Mrs. Kelly, Philip's aunt, to come over and take a look. Mrs. Kelly arrived, walked into the kitchen, and grabbed a mop and a bucket to clean up the weird chalk dust, and immediately screamed. She had slipped, but not on the dust, but on a massive pool of water that had suddenly and inexplicably materialized on the kitchen floor. They cleaned it up. Within minutes, the pool of water returned. They wiped it away again, and it came back. The water wasn't coming from the pipes, the ceiling, or the fridge. It was just pooling on the linoleum out of nowhere. When Joe and Jean Pritchard returned home with their 12-year-old daughter, Diane, they were deeply skeptical. Joe was a no-nonsense man. He checked the plumbing. He checked the roof. Everything was structurally sound. He told his family they were letting their imaginations run away with them. But the house was just warming up. Over the next few days, the small disturbances escalated into a chaotic symphony. The kitchen became a battleground. The family's mechanical tea dispenser, a popular appliance at the time, suddenly activated on its own, violently dumping all the dry leaves onto the counters. Then came the liquids. Green foam began oozing out of the water taps in the toilet bowl, even after Joe turned off the main water valve to the entire house. Lights flickered on and off if a manic hand was flipping the switches. But the fuses were entirely intact. Heavy potted plants in the living room didn't just tip over. Witnesses saw them literally leap out of their ceramic pots, landing feet away on the carpet. The Pritchards were house-proud, stubborn people. Jean flatly refused to be driven out of her home by what she initially thought was a minor, freaky nuisance. To cope with the stress and normalize the terrifying reality, the family gave the entity a nickname. They called him Fred. For a brief period, the activity went quiet, almost as if Fred was gathering strength. But by 1968, the entity returned with a vengeance that made the early flying tea leaves look like child's play. The local press caught wind of it, dubbing the invisible terror, sorry about that, Mr. Nobody. But inside 30 East Drive, Fred was becoming a physical, heavy-handed presence. The walls began to echo with heavy, aggressive knocking that seemed to vibrate through the homes of anyone inside the room. Heavy footsteps paced up and down the stairs when everyone was accounted for in the living room, and then the objects started flying. We aren't talking about keys or coins floating gently. Talking about heavy, dangerous household objects being hurled across rooms with terrifying velocity. A heavy antique grandfather clock that had stood securely in the hallway for years suddenly lifted and tilted forward and came crashing down the staircase, shattering into pieces. Family photographs hanging securely on the walls were found slashed as if by an invisible blade, specifically targeting the faces of the family members. Bed sheets were violently ripped off the beds while the children slept. Entire sofas with family members sitting directly on them would slide inches across the floor on their own. What makes the Pontefract case so unique in the annals of the paranormal history is the sheer volume of outside witnesses. This wasn't a case of history, it was sheer volume of outside witnesses. This wasn't a case of mass hysteria confined to one family. Neighbors reported seeing strange shadowy figures racing through the Pritchard's garden at night. Relatives who came to visit out of the skepticism were instantly converted. During one family gathering, Jean's sister, who openly mocked the idea of a ghost, was sitting at the kitchen table in full view of multiple people. A heavy jug of milk lifted off the counter, inverted itself in midair, and poured its entire contents directly over her head. But Fred also possessed a bizarre, deeply unsettling sense of humor. He had a strange obsession with small physical objects, specifically keys and marbles. Marbles would materialize in midair and drop to the floor, bouncing loudly. House keys would vanish from deep inside pockets or purses, only to be found later jammed inside the internal mechanics of a non-functional, broken vacuum cleaner. And then there were the gloves. One evening, as the family and a few neighbors gathered in the living room to sing Christian hymns, believing the holy music might calm the energy or drive it away, something manifested. It occurred that left everyone paralyzed. Out of thin air, a pair of large, heavy women's fur-lined gloves appeared. The empty gloves floated gracefully into the center of the room and began moving in perfect rhythmic time to the music, mimicking the gestures of a choir conductor. It was an absurd, surreal sight, but the laughter didn't last long because Fred's energy was narrowing down, and its primary target was 12-year-old Diane Pritchard. In almost a classic poltergeist cases, including the infamous Enfield case, what happened a decade later, the anomalous energy tends to focus on a child entering adolescence. The theory among researchers is that the emotional and hormonal vitality of a teenager acts like a premium fuel for a non-physical entity. At 30 East Drive, Diane Pritchard was that fuel. As Diane grew from a child into a teenager, Fred's behavior shifted from mischievous and bizarre to outright malevolent. The physical attacks began. It started in her bedroom. Diane would be lying in bed, trying to sleep through the banging walls, when her entire mattress would violently tilt. On several occasions, she was bodily thrown from her bed onto the floor. She would run downstairs crying, shaking, and bruised, begging her parents to let her sleep in their room. But the most famous and terrifying event of the entire haunting occurred on the staircase. Diane was standing near the bottom of the stairs, talking to her family, when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. Her face went pale. Witnesses watched in absolute horror as Diane's long hair suddenly stood completely on end, straight up into the air, as if charged with an immense static electricity. Before anyone could react, an invisible force grabbed Diane by the throat and the hair. She was violently dragged backward and up the staircase, kicking and screaming, her feet hanging against the wooden steps, as she was pulled upward by an unseen assailant. Joe rushed up the stairs, fighting against a wall of freezing cold air, and managed to grab his daughter, tearing her away from the vacuum of the entity. When they got her downstairs into the light, they found deep red welt marks wrapped around her neck, marks that perfectly resembled the grip of a human hand. The family was terrified. They realized that whatever was in their house wasn't just quirky spirit named Fred. It was something deeply hostile, and it was getting stronger. Desperate and realizing that no amount of stubbornness could protect their children from physical harm, the Pritchards did what many desperate families do. They turned to the church. They contacted a local priest, begging him to come to 30 East Drive to perform an exorcism, or at least bless the home to grant them some form of spiritual sanctuary. The priest arrived, skeptical but willing to help. He gathered the family in the living room, took out his holy water, and began reciting the traditional prayers of protection. Fred did not take kindly to this intrusion. The moment the holy words left the priest's mouth, the house erupted into absolute chaos, a defeating racket exploding overhead. The priest later described it as sounded like dozens of heavy bowling balls being violently cascaded onto the roof of the house. Then the physical environment turned hostile. The white plaster walls of the living room began to bleed, not with blood, but with holy water and moisture that began seeping out of the dry drywall in a massive streaming sheets, ruining the wallpaper. In the middle of the prayers, a heavy brass candlestick lifted off the mantelpiece entirely on its own. It floated into the center of the room, turned horizontal, and hung motionless in midair, pointed directly at the priest like a weapon. The air temperature in the room plummeted to below freezing in a matter of seconds. The priest stopped praying, dropped his cross, and fled the house into the night, reportedly shouting to the neighbors that there was a genuinely evil, unholy presence inside the council home. He refused to ever step foot back inside 30 East Drive. Other religious figures and spiritual mediums tried their hand, and Anglican vicar attempted a blessing. He was met with flying furniture and left thoroughly shaken. During another attempted prayer circle, invisible hands began physically slapping the faces of the people praying, leaving bright red marks. It became clear that religious symbols, rather than repelling the entity, drove it into an absolute state of fury. It was during the peak of this violent escalation that the entity finally showed its face. One night, Joe and Jean were awakened in their bedroom by a profound, suffocating sense of dread. The room was deathly cold. Joe turned his head toward the foot of the bed. Standing in the shadows was a tall, imposing figure. It wore a heavy, coarse, black hooded robe, the distinct habit of a medieval monk. The cowl of the hood was pulled forward, casting the face in absolute, impenetrable darkness. There were no eyes, no skin, just a void of pure blackness beneath the hood. The figure stood perfectly still, watching them, before slowly dissolving into the shadows of the bedroom corner. Over the next year, this robed apparition was seen multiple times, not just by Joe and Jean, but by the children and outside visitors. He would stand at the top of the stairs or linger in the doorway of the bathroom. The family's nickname of Fred suddenly felt entirely inadequate. He was now known across Yorkshire as the Black Monk of Pontefract. Naturally, local historians and paranormal researchers began looking into the land. Why here? Why this ordinary 1950s house? They discovered that 30 East Drive sat on a historically volatile piece of earth. The house was located within walking distance of the ruins of Pontefract Castle, a notorious medieval stronghold known for bloody sieges, executions, and the starvation of King Richard II. Furthermore, the town of Pontefract was once home to the prominent Cluniac Monastery. During the 16th century, under the reign of King Henry VIII, the dissolution of the monasteries took place. Royal soldiers violently dismantled these religious houses, hanging, drawing, and quartering monks who refused to surrender their faith in their hand. Local oral tradition claimed that a specific Cluniac monk had been executed for a heinous crime on the very gallows that once stood on the high ridge where East Drive was eventually built. Whether this entity was truly a ghost of centuries-old monk trapped on the land or a malevolent poltergeist taking on a terrifying form to feed on the family's fear remains one of the great debates in paranormal research. By the early 1970s, as Philip and Diane grew out of their teenage years and began to leave adolescence behind, the energy in the house began to dissipate. The flying objects slowed down, the pools of water dried up, the Black Monk perimeter retreated into the woodwork. The Pritchards lived out their days in the house, having survived an ordeal that would have driven most people to absolute madness. They never made a fortune from their story. They didn't seek the spotlight. They were just an ordinary family that happened to live through an extraordinary nightmare. Today, 30 East Drive still stands. It is owned by a movie producer who bought it out of fascination. It remains largely unchanged. The 1960s wallpaper is still there. The small kitchen is still intact. And paranormal investigators who spend the night there today still report foul smells, disappearing keys, heavy shadows moving up the stairs, and the distinct, unmistakable feeling of being watched by something hidden beneath the black hood. The Black Monk of Pontefract proved that the paranormal doesn't care about gothic aesthetics. It doesn't need a castle. It can find you in your kitchen, your living room, or your hallway. So that's it for tonight's episode of Paranormal Inc. Ohio podcast. If you enjoyed this deep dive into an actual documented case, make sure you subscribe. Like it. Leave a comment. Let me know what you're thinking of the series. And then let me know if there's anything that you recommend me talking about. So, until next time, watch your step on the stairs, or the Black Monk of Pontefract may grab you.